Welcome to a very special edition of Money and Me. This week we are focusing on a single topic, Hong Kong. Now there's a famous quote attributed to Edmund Burke, which is that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. And we've certainly seen evil on an egregious scale this year with the passing of the new security laws in Hong Kong by China. And even for the country that brought us Tiananmen Square and the Cultural Revolution, these new laws take human rights abuses to a whole new level. In fact, just as you and I sit here in our British living rooms, we could apparently be committing a crime in the eyes of the Chinese government. So, what happens now really, and what matters now is how the rest of the world responds. And one man who's certainly on the side of the good is my guest today. I've known him for many years because we happen to go to the same church, but what's more relevant for today's discussion is that he is director of Hong Kong Watch, which is a British-based charity that monitors freedom and civil liberties in the Hong Kong territory. His name is Johnny Patterson. Johnny, welcome to the program.
Great to be with you, Graham.
Now, before we actually go into the detail of these new security laws, let's just put the whole thing in a bit of historical context, because Britain's involvement with Hong Kong goes all the way back to the Opium Wars of the mid-19th century. And I do find it vaguely amusing that in an era when we're supposedly fighting a war on drugs, we once fought wars for drugs. But leaving that aside, can you kind of just give us a 3-minute potted history of Britain's involvement in Hong Kong from those days up to the handover by Chris Patten in 1997?
Yeah, of course. Britain's history in Hong Kong wasn't one of our finest hours. We initially, at least, the Opium Wars were a war, as you put it, for drugs, to open up the Chinese market to Indian opium, and not the British Empire's finest hour by any means. And so Hong Kong at the end of the Opium Wars was one of the concessions that the British government demanded of China. And so what was essentially a fairly small fishing village in Hong Kong harbour became Britain's kind of foothold in that part of the world. As the period moved on, things began to change, and I think the key period was really post World War II and once the communist regime came into power in China, because what happened then was firstly that Hong Kong continued to play a vital role in the region as a trading hub. So what was once a fishing village became an absolutely critical part of the British Empire, and somewhere that became very prosperous very quickly. But it also became a city that was a place of refuge for people fleeing the worst excesses of the Maoist regime. And so you have millions of people in Hong Kong whose grandparents were in mainland China and fled for a variety of reasons, whether that was because of the Great Leap Forward famine in the 50s, the Cultural Revolution in the 60s, or a number of other kind of communist campaigns. I know a number of people who literally swam from Shenzhen to Hong Kong to escape during that period. And so what you have in Hong Kong is a strange city where the introduction of British rule was really not in good circumstances at all, not something that the British government can be proud of, but it became a place of refuge for people. And so the history is complex, and one of the things that's interesting when you meet Hong Kongers is they have a really keen sense of the value of liberalism, liberty, and their fundamental freedoms and the rule of law. And so that these values are ones that I think, because they fled the worst excesses of communism, people hold on to very dearly. And in the 80s and 90s, the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong really started to grow in strength. And for example, the memorialization of the Tiananmen Massacre is something that happens every single year until it was banned due to pandemic this year. In Hong Kong, on the June 4th, there's a massive vigil in memory of the victims of the Tiananmen Square massacre. In the mid 80s, the British government essentially became aware that due to the situation of the new territories in Hong Kong, which is part of Hong Kong, and the fact that they only had that part of Hong Kong on a 99-year lease, they would need to hand Hong Kong back to China in 1997. And so negotiations took place, and the basis on which the handover was made was signed in the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which is a treaty and international law that guarantees Hong Kong's rights and freedoms for 50 years after the handover from Hong Kong from Britain to China. So in 1997, it was supposed to be that the rights and freedoms enshrined in Hong Kong's basic law would remain unchanged for 50 years after the handover. And so Chris Patten was involved in negotiating that between 1992 and 97 and kind of facilitating the handover. And in 1997, Prince Charles left on the royal yacht and British rule was over and the Chinese took over. And what followed from that initially seemed to work fairly well, but as I'm sure we'll come on to, things have taken a downward spiral since.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say that, my impression certainly was that in the immediate aftermath, things were going pretty smoothly, but then something triggered this kind of protest movement. I think those of us in the rest of the world became aware of perhaps around about 2014. So what were the kind of underlying tensions that actually led to that protest move?
So I think it's worth going back a little bit further before doing that and looking at the history of national security legislation in Hong Kong. So Hong Kong's basic law is a document of contradictions. It's a document that reflects the nature of international legal treaties, and the Chinese were very keen to have a pretty strict national security law in place under what was known as Article 23 in Hong Kong from the start. The British government didn't really want that, and so there were these two items that were left unfinished in the original constitutional negotiations. One was Article 23, which the British weren't going to put in place because it essentially breached the other human rights safeguards in Hong Kong's constitution. So Article 39 provides that Hong Kong must abide by the international human rights standards. Article 23 in itself doesn't fit with those standards, and so there's this inherent contradiction in the constitution which was left unresolved. And then there's Article 45, which is the right to universal suffrage. That was the other kind of piece of the jigsaw that was left for the Chinese government to finish. And so in 2003, in the last big pandemic during the SARS, there was a mass protest movement against the enactment of Article 23, and 500,000 people took to the streets in Hong Kong to protest against the enactment of national security legislation, not that dissimilar to what's just been passed. And it was shelved because at that point, Hong Kong people probably had a bigger stick, and the Chinese economy was smaller, and the Chinese government were a bit less assertive. So they stepped back from forcing it through, and the protest movement succeeded. But that kind of formed the basis of the democratic movement in Hong Kong's energy and life. And there was a new political party that formed out of that, and a regular protest on July the 1st, where hundreds of thousands would turn up every year. And that protest movement then laid the groundwork for what happened in 2014 with the Umbrella Movement, and that was a protest for universal suffrage. So the other element of the constitution that was unfinished was the Hong Kongers were saying, we want to have full universal suffrage. And the Chinese had offered what one leader in the democratic movement to me described to me as kind of a fake democracy, where you had to pick between a rotten apple, a rotten orange, and a rotten tomato, and where the CCP would decide the three candidates, and then Hong Kongers were given the choice between the three, and the people weren't happy with that because they knew that this would be seen by the Chinese as the fulfillment of Article 45, whatever settlement was had in 2014. And so you had young people on the streets, thousands of them, and that led to 3 months of protests, which ultimately failed, you could argue. Or it didn't fail necessarily. It awoke much of the population to the importance of democracy and human rights and freedoms, but it didn't achieve the goal that they'd set out, which was for universal suffrage. And
so in a sense, we talk about the original kind of involvement in Hong Kong not being our finest hour, but surely we need to also attach a bit of criticism here to Chris Patten for leaving these two enormous holes in the agreement that we then walked away from in '97, because we kind of hung these people out to dry with no proper rights to vote and no clarity on the security law.
I mean, probably the responsibility lies with Thatcher rather than Patten, but yes, I agree with you, because it was the agreement signed in '84 that left the real issues, because it didn't, and then Patten tried to fast track things, but the Chinese just in '97 they just kind of removed anything they disliked immediately. And so that's what happened.
Okay, so then we get this kind of, I suppose, new and much stronger regime running China under President Xi, and clearly, as we've seen elsewhere in the world, in the South China Seas, on the border with India, he likes throwing his weight around. And now, having given COVID-19 to the rest of the world as a convenient smokescreen and distraction, they go in 2020 with these new laws. So let's get to the meat of it, Johnny. What do these laws actually allow China to do in the Hong Kong territory?
I mean, I would see it as a constitutional coup. Essentially, it transforms Hong Kong's constitution because it places the national security law is given precedence over the Hong Kong basic law, the Hong Kong constitution. That means that China can do basically whatever they want because the charges within the law are so broad and that pretty much any member of the political opposition could be found guilty of one of the various charges, whether it's collusion with foreign political organizations or secession or whatever it is. You just have to be a bit creative as a lawyer, and the Chinese have the ability to basically find whoever they want guilty and chuck them in jail for 10 years minimum. So it's a terrifying law for people, and I think there are people, a lot of my friends on the ground are really nervous about the implications of this.
And I think they immediately disbanded the pro-freedom political party, and some of the leaders that were quite well known have had to kind of either go out of sight or even leave the territory.
Yeah, so not all the pro-democracy parties have been disbanded, but the ones associated with the protest movements have been, and yeah, there are a number of them have arrived in the UK recently, and it's really alarming, and others are nervous about arrest in the next few months.
And tell me about the beautifully named Office of Safeguarding National Security in the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, because I believe it's staffed by Chinese henchmen who are operating completely above the law.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, yeah, they're operating within the national security law, but that law gives them the power to do pretty much whatever they want. So it's, yeah, truly alarming. And I think the fact that they're institutionalizing that office is quite something, because it means that there are hundreds of people in Hong Kong there to essentially with the sole job of enforcing this dreadful piece of legislation. And that's one of the things that, yeah, it's grim.
And I believe they've actually been, they've wasted no time in vigorously enforcing it. I mean, can you give me some examples of the sort of people they've been targeting and what's been happening to them?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the most prominent examples was Jimmy Lai, who is he's the owner of the biggest pro-democracy newspaper, and the implications of that for press freedom. He's been charged with a range of charges under national security law, and I think the implications of that for press freedom are quite profound if he's found guilty. Obviously, it's going to be there are going to be some fascinating test cases in Hong Kong's courts, which historically have been pretty reliable in the coming months, to see how and whether any of the judges have the guts to kind of go against Beijing's wishes on some of these cases, or whether these cases are all going to be cut and dry convictions. So, but if Jimmy is found guilty, then I think that will have a real chilling effect on the press in Hong Kong, because it will be a kind of sending the signal that if you push too hard in exposing the government for what they're doing, then you are liable to prosecution. Others are young people. A lot of the others are kind of young people who are involved in the protest movement, who's kind of are now facing decades in jail, and yeah, it's great.
It's really strange, but also I think one of the more bizarre aspects of this is that it seems to apply globally, so that just by having this conversation, you and I technically become presumably criminals in Hong Kong.
Well, yeah, potentially. Again, it's going to be interesting to see how they apply that. I think one of the things with this kind of legislation is just gives the government the power to do whatever they want, whether or not the Chinese and the Hong Kong government are going to would think it was a shrewd move to prosecute you, Graham, for convening this conversation is a different question, and I probably wouldn't. But the global scope of the legislation, the fact that it makes it an extraterritorial crime is, and I mean, for an organisation like ours, it means I probably won't travel back to Hong Kong because of the because I potentially am committing a crime every day with what we're doing.
But I don't know where this, I'm no expert on international law, but this sounds completely ridiculous. I mean, is there any kind of precedent for it internationally, or is it simply that if you and I were to go and step back onto Chinese or Hong Kong territory, we might find ourselves in trouble? But I hear talk about, for example, I think Britain has cancelled its extradition treaty with Hong Kong as a kind of protest against this. I mean, could they actually try and extradite people that you mentioned who've come to the UK back there to face trial?
Yeah, I mean, I think they would. If Britain was a closer ally of China, they would definitely be putting in extradition requests for those on there. There's that list of activists who are there's an arrest warrant out for, and those guys would be definitely there would definitely be extradition requests for them.
For some years now, there's been a sort of a lazy Daily Mail journalism type narrative that human rights are somehow some soppy nanny state thing that's been imposed on us by those liberal lefties in Brussels and the EU. My own opinion is that human rights are like toilet roll in supermarkets. You only notice them when they're gone, and this strikes me as a massive blow for human rights. What do you see as the overall impact on that, and why should we here in the West be concerned about it?
Well, I mean, I think the impact of this is profound for Hong Kong culture and society. It's people who have been free to speak their mind are now no longer free to speak their mind in the same way, and it's facing huge prison sentences and potentially also it's the collapse of the checks and balances in the Hong Kong system. It's the fact that where things could go from here that I think is particularly alarming. That right now, when we're in a place where we wait to see how it will be applied in the long run. It may be that they use it with comparative restraint, or it may be that they decide to use this to really clamp down on anyone who's in favour of democracy in Hong Kong. We just don't know. But it's the fact that there are the checks and balances and the restraints on state power that perhaps were there in the Constitution previously are no longer there, and the human rights safeguards just don't matter anymore because in the name of national security, the Chinese government and the Hong Kong government are willing to do whatever they like. The implications of that for us, I think there's two aspects to it. The first is that for the British government, the history and the fact that we are culpable for this to some degree means that there is, I think, a moral duty for the UK to continue to take action. And I'm really glad that the British have made this offer to the BNO passport holders, and I think that's a helpful thing. And a lot of the Hong Kongers I know felt that the UK should have done that 25 years ago, because the citizens of Hong Kong, they were the one colony in the British Empire that weren't given the right to self-determination, and so their future was decided essentially in high-level negotiations in Beijing. And for many of them, it was a betrayal that the British just cancelled their passports and didn't really give them any rights. And so I think it's a really positive thing that the UK have taken that step. I think the other dimension in terms of why this matters is potentially more of a kind of financial one in some ways. Hong Kong is an international financial centre, and part of the reason for that is that it has historically been known reliably to have rule of law. It's been a place where East meets West, and the US and China have found kind of and loads of dollar trading and everything. And and on lots of those fronts, the implications of the national security law and the power grab by China and their total disregard for international law, it could have profound implications, and it could be that we see a capital flight and other things down the line. And I think that's one of the things that is going to be an interesting one to watch, because I think the full ramifications of this aren't yet clear, and to some extent it will be dependent on how the Hong Kong government act now as to what happens. It will also be dependent on how the US government react, because if they were to start to treat Hong Kong like the rest of China, and to some extent these actions might justify that course of action, then you could see a situation where the kind of restrictions that you see being placed on Chinese financial institutions could be placed on those in Hong Kong, and then the implications of that for the global financial system would be pretty profound. But we're not there yet. But I think that's something to watch.
Okay, so I mean, I think this is one of the key things is how the rest of the world responds, and there've been some things, as you say, like the offer of passports from Britain. There's been the extradition treaty. There's been a little bit of a response from America. I mean, where is the United Nations in all of this?
So the UN have UN human rights experts have put out a number of statements of strong kind of condemnation of the law. There was one statement signed by 50 different UN human rights experts that was very clear that the law is bad news. The UN Secretary General, I don't know whether he has I think he takes too much funding from the Chinese government, possibly, to have the independence to say what we would like him to say. And I think the other thing about the UN as an institution is increasingly one where China can collect the votes of the Belt and Road countries. And I don't know how much you've followed that, but there's a sense that it's tricky because the West it's maybe a failure of Western diplomacy that a large swathes of the world will back China when they say that other countries shouldn't interfere in their own internal affairs, rather than backing universal human rights standards. And so that's,
Yeah, indeed. Now, on a corporate level, I know HSBC and Standard Chartered Bank have kowtowed to Beijing and said, yeah, okay, we'll work within this. I even read of an Australian bank where one of their star financial traders used his personal Twitter account to say something that was mildly critical of China. This was picked up by China's monitoring services, who then applied enormous pressure to the management of that bank, more or less saying, if you want to keep doing business in China, you've got to fire this guy. And the weak, pathetic management of that bank obeyed, and the guy got fired. I mean, are any of these companies going to have the cojones to stand up to this, or are they all going to just throw their employees under the bus to keep in with their friends in Beijing?
I think that would depend on how international governments in the West respond to some extent. Because HSBC, 70% of their profits is in Hong Kong, so they're not going to have the guts to risk that unless it reaches the point where, and I mean, there already are some of these situations. Carrie Lam's been put on a sanctions list in the US, and suddenly HSBC is in a very tricky situation because they can't risk upsetting the US now that the US are using some of their financial muscle, but at the same time they're caught. And I think for some of these banks whose whole business model has historically been mediating between East and West, it's going to become very difficult. But like in the same way that Hong Kong's position is quite difficult now, that kind of its USP is under threat. I think there could be, for some of these banks, life could become very difficult if the US start being forensic in the way they apply sanctions, because so much of their business model relies on this kind of being a gateway. Otherwise, I think if it will entirely depend on how international governments react. And my sense is the UK aren't currently in the position where they're going to put any meaningful pressure on Standard Chartered and HSBC. And so if that doesn't happen, then I think they will obviously side with, they'll take the least hard route out.
Yeah, I think one of the fascinating things here is to now look at the impact on Hong Kong, because Hong Kong property prices, for example, have always been kind of second only to Monaco in terms of how high they are. They've been on the slide for a couple of years, and I can't really see that trend changing anytime soon. So what do you think will be the full economic impact on the territory when people start to realize, the full effect of these measures as they start to bite?
Well, it could be very profound. It's going to be fascinating to see how China play it, because what we've seen in the last few months has been kind of almost state coordinated influx of red capital into Hong Kong. So red capital being kind of mainland backed businesses or just mainland businesses. And so huge IPOs of mainland firms. So it's possible Hong Kong could just become almost like another Shanghai, a Chinese financial hub, without quite the same global role down the line. Obviously, it's got lots of expertise and that will continue to be relevant. At the same time, it's possible. I think one of the questions will be, what are the implications for China if the West stops seeing Hong Kong in the same light? Because so at the moment, kind of 60% or something of the investment flows in and out of China are mediated through Hong Kong. What does it mean if Hong Kong stops being seen as different to China? And how does China then act? And can Singapore replace it? Probably not. They're quite different. Hong Kong and Singapore are quite different. And so it could be have real meaningful ramifications for the Chinese economy. But I think a lot of the answer to your question is going to be a result of a kind of the wider geopolitical context and what happens between US and China, and who's president in the US. And lots of these questions are going to shape exactly, in a sense, the fate of Hong Kong. Hong Kongers aren't going to decide their fate to some extent.
Okay. I mean, well, for me, one of the sort of dreams almost would be that we have I don't know, 1 million or so of these financial experts in Hong Kong suddenly decide to come to London, and we turn, Brexit Britain becomes the Singapore of Europe. I mean, what's been the response of people in Hong Kong to the offer of British citizenship? And are we likely to see a mass exodus anytime soon?
I think people are watching and waiting. I think people have been very grateful for the lifeline, but I think there is a sense of waiting to see how Beijing enact this law and how draconian it is, and exactly how the UK puts its offer out there, because obviously the details of the scheme in the UK haven't come into force yet. So that scheme properly comes into force in January, and I think we probably won't clearly have an idea of numbers until it's actually being properly implemented. I think that's possible, particularly if there is a real clampdown in Hong Kong. It's possible that there could be a mass movement of people. And on the other side of it, it's possible that the UK making this offer will encourage Beijing to be more restrained because of the risk of flight of talent. And so, in a sense, that's one of the valuable things of the UK's offer, is that it means that there's this it's offering Hong Kong as an insurance policy, which then actually gives Beijing an incentive not to push too hard.
Also, I think there'll be a real challenge for them to attract new talent, because a lot of Western expats who are ambitious in that financial services world previously have taken assignments in Hong Kong as part of their whole kind of career development. I think you'd have to be sectioned under the Mental Health Act to go there now. So they're certainly going to see, if not a brain drain, they're certainly going to find it hard to attract new talent there. But let's just talk about, it's easy to look at something like this and say, what can I do? There's this great big totalitarian government stamping its foot on this little territory. What can I, sitting here in Britain, do? Now, I mean, on a personal level, I've dropped out of a couple of partnership discussions with Chinese organizations because I just decided I didn't want anything more to do with China. I know my wife is very careful now. She looks at where products are made. It's a little bit like the whole Huawei 5G thing on a personal scale. I'm not going to buy it because it's Chinese. I mean, what can we in Britain do to have any impact on this appalling situation in Hong Kong?
Mm. Well, I mean, I think one of the things is that community groups and others can look at properly offering a welcome to Hong Kongers if they decide to come. So there's proper integration and things. And I think the other point is making sure that the government know this is a salient political issue and something that the people in the UK genuinely care about. So there's a combination of the political action, the writing to MPs and whatever, but then also the offering of support to people as they come in and ensuring that this isn't a policy that leads to a rise in bigotry or whatever, but is a policy where people feel genuinely welcome and integrated.
No, absolutely. And I don't know if I'm getting too conspiracy theorist here, but I sense I'm not seeing as much in the mainstream Western media about this as I expected. I mean, are even our media enthralled to Beijing and being told not to get too negative in their coverage?
I think, I mean, in my view, the coverage of the protests over the last year has been reasonably good. There are a number of points where big broadsheets had Hong Kong on its front pages, and I think during the pandemic the coverage has been less, and it's been one of the classic kind of authoritarian tactic. Use a time of turmoil to push through draconian legislation. We've seen Viktor Orban doing it in Hungary, and we see Xi Jinping doing it, and I'm sure there are lots of other examples at the moment of the fact that the world is distracted, providing a kind of an excuse for people to push stuff through. But I think it has been picked up relatively well in the media, in my view. But yeah.
I think my final point on this, really, I think, Johnny, would be to turn the whole thing around and say, what's in it for China? Why do they want to kill the golden goose? What's the motivation? You know, in the bigger picture, why have they done this, and what do they think they're going to? How do they think they're going to benefit from?
I think nationalism is one of the key things that drives Xi Jinping, and legitimates his rule, and that a lot of his actions in Hong Kong are playing towards a domestic audience. They're not playing to Hong Kongers, and they're not playing to the world, and they're a bit illiterate about how it's going to be perceived by the rest of the world, and may not fully understand the ramifications for China's place in the world of what they've done, but that a lot of it is nationalist, and it probably plays quite well domestically. That the hammer plays better than allowing the rioters to run riot, as it were. So I think that's the dynamic, and the thing that scares me is that we could see something similar happen in Taiwan, but we just kind of have to pray we don't go there. But you could see, I think there are discussions going around that people think are concerned that Xi Jinping may turn his attention and public discussion in China to Taiwan next, and that would be very concerning, I think.
So finally, Johnny, obviously this has been a momentous year in Hong Kong. What does this mean for your own organisation, Hong Kong Watch, and what's your strategy going forward in the light of these unprecedented and frankly unexpected events?
Well, I mean, I think two things. Firstly, it means that the decisions by the UK government and others to make tangible policy decisions actually gives us quite a lot of areas to hold people to account. We need to make sure that the British government's policies and words are put into practice, and I think that's kind of a big project for us in some ways. Similarly, with some of the other countries that have taken action, the Australians and others, we're kind of looking to keep people accountable to the promises they made in the last few months. I think the second thing is it'll be easy for the world to get distracted and lose sight of what's happening in Hong Kong. I think the national security law will become the new normal, and I think in that context it will be really important that organisations like ours continue to shine the spotlight on what's going on.
Absolutely, you're doing really important work there, and more power to your elbow. Johnny Patterson from Hong Kong Watch, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Graham. Thanks.